Gerry Galvin. You're very, very welcome to Project Management Paradise. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Caitríona. Delighted to be with you.
Great. We've been waiting a while to get together. So we've lots of things to talk about governance in the public sector, or governance of public sector projects. But you didn't start in the public sector, Gerry. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into project management.
Okay, well, I qualified as a civil engineer and I started working in the public sector actually for the first 5 years in a city council, where as part of my role, I was involved in project managing direct labour crews carrying out minor works programmes. But I then left the public sector and went to a private sector firm of consulting engineers, where I got much more involved in project management in the full cycle, from feasibility to planning and design to procurement and construction and contract closeout for both public sector and private sector clients. After spending 8 years there, I rejoined the public sector when I joined the government ministry responsible for water services in Ireland, both policy and investment. And as part of my role there, I represented the department for approximately 12 years on the Government Construction Contracts Committee, which had the oversight role on all public sector capital expenditure, both procedures and contracts. And as in that role, part of the time I was on that committee was in developing and implementing the Capital Works Management Framework, which was implementing the governance procedures applying to any project benefiting from exchequer funding to complete it. So then, when Irish Water, the national water utility, was set up in 2013, I joined Irish Water in the role of Chief Technical Advisor and on the management team, where as part of my role again, I was served as a quorum member of both the Construction Approvals Committee, the Contract Approval Committee and the Expenditure Approvals Committee.
You had a little sandwich time in the private sector, Gerry, between your government appointments. Tell us what you found were the fundamental differences between governance in the public sector and the private sector. Granted that they were very different projects, but the governance might have some similarities.
One of the big differences in public sector projects is that they tend to be large, complex projects carried out very much in public view. So they involve a large number of statutory authorities and other non-statutory bodies, as well as impacting on business and community groups. And for that reason, everything and every decision made throughout the life cycle of that public project implementation has to be very transparent and also has to be communicated to those stakeholders with the evidence supporting those. So examples of those type of projects are, say, drinking water and wastewater treatment plant projects, transportation projects like roads and public transport, hospitals and educational institutions, social housing projects, and things like public walking trails, public realm improvement works in pedestrianisation of town centres and that sort of thing. So they tend to be very much in the public view. And they don't always have a clearly calculatable business case in terms of return on investment. Right. They tend to be more facilitating other projects or developments, or improving amenities, or improving transportation or water quality, for example. And they also tend to take a significant length of time, often 10 years or more, to go from project inception through to project completion. And that also lends itself to a greater number of risks and a greater number of difficulties, including, for example, mobility of members of the project teams who can tend to move along for many reasons over that length of period of time.
So it's a huge melange of potential issues waiting to happen before you even sign the contract initially. And as you mentioned, you have such a great number of stakeholders, often what appears to the public like an infinite timeline, whereas all of these do live in a plan and hopefully under one central plan. But when things do go wrong, and as you said, everything is done in the public eye, there is nowhere to hide. What kind of scale of accountability does a typical public sector project entail?
Well, there's a huge level of accountability on most public sector projects. Firstly, the public sector body delivering them is responsible to their board or their council, if it's a council, to their elected members. Then they'll be accountable to the funding department, if it's a government department providing the funding. And ultimately, as it is if they're publicly funded, they'll be accountable to the local ratepayer or indeed to the national taxpayer. And because of that, they'll be subject to either local audit or national audit, and ultimately to public expenditure review committees at a national level.
So there's a fantastic trail, paper and otherwise, of who's done what and when and why, and how much does it cost.
And it's very important, again, because of the long duration of these projects, that there is a retrievable archive of all documentation and records of decisions taken from the inception of the project through to its completion.
And for that receptacle, Gerry, what's the greatest challenge to maintain the governance on these projects around those kind of artifacts?
Well, one of the big challenges is document management and ensuring that the records and the supporting documentation is maintained in a central repository that is retrievable. Obviously, for many years, these records were kept in paper format and therefore proved very difficult to retrieve, as well as, of course, having the risk of fire or flooding destroying such records.
Yeah, and there's a number of local authorities in many countries who are digitizing all of those documents so that they still can maintain the integrity of those repositories.
Exactly, and those project developers, like the public bodies, and also their advisors, like architects, consulting engineers, project managers, are also digitizing all these documents now, so that they will always remain retrievable.
Yeah, and it makes for far more effective collaboration as well, doesn't it? Where you've got the latest or greatest version of a document that the other parties may be working with as well. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and what can go well? You've mentioned a few things there about what could go wrong, but you mentioned earlier on, Gerry, as well, when you were talking about all of the stakeholders. It's like a wheel with so many spokes on it. What advice would you give when it comes to managing communications with such a breadth of customers or partners as you would in a public sector project?
Well, it's very important to develop at the outset and maintain throughout the project a stakeholder communication strategy, and to identify the needs of those stakeholders as regards information, and indeed the channels in which are best suited to meeting those needs. Some will be quite happy to receive email updates. Others will look for social media commentary. Others will want more formal or will require more formal notification. But it's very important, particularly during the planning phases, to consult with all the stakeholders, to understand what their issues might be with the project, and to communicate with them openly and clearly. And if you can do that, it will ensure that the project will get through the planning process with minimum objections, and thereby avoiding any risk of appeals or indeed judicial reviews, which would obviously delay these projects significantly if they were to arise. Yeah. So a communication strategy is essential to ensuring the smooth passage through the statutory processes required during the planning phase of a project.
And Gerry, in a position such as that, in these huge public sector projects, and you mentioned somebody might like an email, somebody might like a text, somebody might like to see it up on one of the social platforms. Can you kind of manage how can you manage a kind of one size fits all, or is it possible to maintain that kind of communications?
You shouldn't have a one size fits all. I suppose that's the basic point I'm making. Your strategy should include a stakeholder matrix, which identifies, first of all, the issues that are of importance to these stakeholders, but also what communication channel that they are looking for. Some might want face-to-face meetings. Like public meetings are a very effective way of transparently communicating with both elected members and with community groups as to the plans and progress in implementing a project.
And obviously the follow-up of all of these communications, so the stakeholders are on the part of the public sector itself. Again, it's all about transparency, and everything should be clear to everybody as well.
Absolutely. There is an onus on public sector bodies to ensure transparency in their decision making, and in particular in how they're spending public funds in the interest of the local ratepayer or the national taxpayer as to how whatever way the project is being funded.
So, Gerry, we were talking there just a few minutes ago about things that might happen to delay a project, like appeals or judicial reviews, or even things outside of our kind of control, like that, like inclement weather that might upset. You worked in the water sector for a long time, and you might have some underground river that suddenly bubbles through, and it will change the whole trajectory of your project, like literally and physically. How would you manage changes like that? What can you do to to keep your project as best on track as you can?
But that all comes down to risk management and initially identifying all these potential risks. And then no matter how remote they might be, I'm sure anybody planning a project 3 years ago did not include a coronavirus pandemic as a risk. But there are several other risks, such as the one you mentioned, like a flooding event or other severe weather event, that should be anticipated in a risk management strategy, and to have the mitigation measures identified and ready to go if that risk materializes during the course of the project.
Absolutely. If it gets written, it gets attended to, and if it gets attended to, it gets done.
Exactly. And obviously you'll have a long list of risks identified. So the important thing then is to be able to rate those risks as regards their probability and their impact, and to clearly put more effort into the more significant risks, those that are rated more highly, because they'll either delay the project or they'll end up in a cost overrun on the project, and to put the resources into mitigating those risks from the outset.
Yes, and ultimately that does cost more time and money. So, Gerry, if you put yourself back into your boots when you were starting out in the public sector, after your time in the private sector, what tips would you give to a program manager starting out?
The first thing is to ensure that everybody involved in both the project team, in the senior management in the public body, and among all the stakeholders, understands the governance framework under which the project is being delivered. Because delays in decision making can be as big a contributor to cost overruns as unforeseen weather conditions, for example. So it's important that everybody involved in decision making understands what their role is, how important timely decision making is in ensuring the project remains on time and on budget. So it's very important to have a clear governance framework set out, and that everybody involved in the decision making within that framework at whatever level understands the importance of the role they are playing to the delivery of the project.
Yeah, it's like the spokes in the wheel analogy again. The wheel, the integrity of the wheel is compromised if not everybody is doing their bit, as it were.
Exactly. Or the chain analogy, it's only as strong as its weakest link.
That's it. That's it. And Gerry, I'm sure you've met many challenges along the way. Tell me, what was the greatest challenge you experienced on a project and how you managed to mitigate and manage it?
I suppose the greatest challenge in all public sector projects is what I referred to earlier, is on stakeholder management. And in ensuring the wide range of stakeholders, many of whom will have competing interests, understand the rationale for the decisions made. They mightn't agree with the decision made because it impacts on them, but they need to understand the rationale as to how the developer, the public body developing the project, has weighed up the different interests and arrives at the decision they are taking to deliver the project.
So did you ever have to don your referee uniform?
Not, I suppose, in stakeholder management. Yes, in other ways regarding, say, dealing with contractual disputes between a contractor and a public body who was implementing or using government funding to implement a project. And in fact, to be fair, over the years I was dealing with such type of disputes, they tend to fall both ways. Sometimes they fell in favour of the contractor, other times they fell in favour of the public sector client.
Yeah, and it's that objectivity really that'll bring you through to the right solution anyway.
Well, if you're carrying out, again, going back to carrying out a proper risk assessment and using the best evidence available at the time of you're making the decision, is the safeguard in ensuring the fairness of that decision.
Yeah, and that should not be news to any of the stakeholders either, you know, if they're fully engaged on the project. For some, you mentioned earlier on, Gerry, some of these projects can span, you know, 10 years or more, depending on if it's a transformation project or regeneration projects. What challenges do projects of this size and this duration present?
Well, I suppose the biggest challenge is faced by, as I mentioned briefly earlier, the mobility of staff on the project team and the potential loss of corporate memory as a result of that departure. So unless there is a clearly documented system supporting the delivery of the project, there will be nothing to stop a stakeholder group from arguing that they had agreed something with a senior project team member 10 years ago about how a certain issue was to be dealt with at the construction stage, and there's nobody there now with any record of that discussion because the files may have gone with the individual who was left.
Right.
And that's, again, the importance of having a digitized document management system to maintain those type of records over the duration of such, the long duration of such a project delivery.
And Gerry, like sometimes the conversations will be had, or maybe emails will be exchanged, but they're not escalated up to the central repository as we should. What do you do in situations like that? Or can you, is there any way that you can kind of corral all of those kind of spurious conversations or agreements or contracts or whatever to ensure that they do end up in the right place?
Well, as you say, a lot of it is down to the individuals following the procedures. A lot of the public bodies I was dealing with were subject to freedom of information legislation. And of course, emails and even handwritten notes of conversations are considered records under freedom of information legislation. So all such documentation should be maintained.
Excellent.
So in saying that, it can only be through proper training and having procedures in place with the individuals involved to ensure that their record keeping is sufficient. I remember as a young engineer told the most important thing about any aspect of contract management were the 3 R's: records, records, and records.
That was a very sage piece of advice, Gerry, because we can't remember it all. Gerry, you're like an encyclopedia, and I think we've just barely touched on topics that we'd love to talk more about, or certainly I'd love to engage with you when we have a quandary about how we can get out of them. Thank you very, very much for your time and sharing your experience with us on Project Management Paradise.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.